The night came down hard and merciless, as if the heavens themselves had decided that no mortal beneath should have peace. Outside, the wind screamed across the frozen fields, carrying sharp daggers of frost through every gap and crack in the walls of the little hut. Inside, where a family of 6 huddled close around a waning fire, there was little to shield them from the storm. Their roofs sagged with damp straw, their walls shivered in the gusts, and their breaths rose in white clouds, visible even in the dark. The hut belonged to Martin, a peasant farmer whose hands were as calloused as bark, whose back had long ago bent beneath the weight of both labour and hunger. His wife, Agnes, sat beside him, her face pale in the flickering firelight, holding their youngest child wrapped in what little cloth remained unpatched. Around them lay their other children, Thomas, 12 years old, and already gaunt from weeks of rationing. Little Margaret, barely 8, her lips cracked from the dry cold. And baby John, squirming in Agnes's arms with a weak, pitiful cry. Beside the hearth, the old grandmother slumped, her bony shoulders hunched beneath a patched cloak, whispering prayers into the smoke. The fire sputtered low. It had been fed with the last dry wood hours earlier, and now it clung desperately to life, glowing red like the embers of some dying giant. Martin leaned forward, blowing softly, urging it to live just a little longer. He knew the truth. If the fire went out before dawn, the cold would creep into their bones and settle there, and not all of them would wake in the morning. The hut was no true shelter. Its walls were made of wattle and daub, thin sticks woven together and smeared with mud, straw, and even dung. It kept out the sight of the storm, but little else. The wind howled through every gap, teasing their thin cloaks, snuffing out warmth the way a miser snuffs out candles. A hole covered with an animal hide served as a window, but the hide had stiffened into ice, brittle and useless. The roof sagged under the weight of months of snow and rain, thatch darkened with rot. Martin often thought it looked less like a roof than the carcass of some dead beast draped across the rafters. Tonight, it leaked droplets of freezing water, splashing into the dirt floor where straw had been thrown down. The floor itself had hardened into frozen mud, the cold seeping up from below like the ghost of the earth itself, pressing against their feet, their knees, their very marrow. Agnes rocked the baby gently, whispering a lullaby that had once been sweet, but now trembled with desperation. Every cry from the child was another nail in the coffin of her nerves. "He won't quiet," she said softly. "He's too cold, Martin. He's freezing." Martin pressed his rough hand against the child's chest. It was frighteningly cool. He clenched his jaw. "He'll quiet when the fire lives," he said, though the words were hollow. Thomas stirred. "Father," he said, his voice a thin reed in the storm's chorus. "The embers are dying." "I know." Martin searched the shadows for anything he had not yet burned. A scrap of old wood, a forgotten stick. But all that remained was damp straw and a broken tool handle. He took the handle and fed it into the flames. It caught slowly, smoke filling the small space until his eyes stung and watered. The grandmother coughed into her cloak. "The saints preserve us," she whispered. "The saints see us through the night," Margaret whimpered. "Grandmother, will we die?" Silence fell heavy, thicker than the smoke. Only the fire crackled, feeble and uncertain. Martin met his wife's eyes across the dim glow. They had spoken of death before, whispered of it in the corners when the children slept. Every winter it stalked the village like a hunter, choosing. Some households, sparing others, never merciful, never fair. "No," Agnes said at last, fiercely, though her own eyes glistened. "No, child, we will live." She gathered Margaret closer, wrapping her in the same cloak that shielded the baby. "Your father will keep us warm." Martin turned back to the fire, guilt gnawing at his belly as cruelly as hunger. Warmth was not a thing he could summon out of will alone. He felt like a general asked to fight with no soldiers, no weapons, only his bare hands against the cold. Outside, the wind battered the hut like a living enemy, rattling the walls. Snow swirled in through cracks, dusting the straw, the floor, their very blankets. It settled in Margaret's hair until she looked like a tiny old woman, white before her time. The storm had no pity. The baby's cries weakened into little gasps. Agnes rocked harder, her whispers breaking into sobs. "Please, God," she prayed aloud. "Please, let him live through the night. Take me instead, but let him live," the grandmother croaked from her corner. "Feed the fire with the straw," she urged. "It'll burn, though quick." Martin obeyed. He heaped armfuls of straw onto the embers. For a moment it seemed futile. But then the flames leapt up, hungrily devouring the dry stalks, flaring bright enough to chase shadows into the corners. Heat rolled outward, weak but real. The family sighed in relief, all except Martin, who knew it would last only minutes. Still, for those minutes, life returned. Thomas stretched his hands toward the glow. Margaret pressed her cheek against her mother's chest and closed her eyes. Even the baby quieted, lulled by warmth and the crackle of flames. Martin looked. At them all. His family circled around a fire that was no more than a candle against the endless dark. His heart ached, with both love and despair. Was this survival? Or was it merely delaying the inevitable? The grandmother began to hum an old hymn. Her voice was cracked and thin, but it wove through the hut like a fragile thread, binding them together against the cold. Agnes joined in softly. Then Thomas, his boyish voice trembling, added his notes. Even Margaret sang in whispers, her head still tucked against her mother. Martin did not sing. He stared at the flames, seeing in them both hope and doom. The hymn rose, faded, and fell back into silence. The straw burned away quickly. Flames shrank once more into red coals. The room dimmed again. Martin rose stiffly. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders and moved to the door. The wind slapped him like a giant's hand, nearly driving him back inside. He pushed the plank door closed again, cursing under his breath. There was nothing out there but snow and darkness and death. No wood, no warmth, nothing. When he turned back, Agnes was staring at him. He could see the question in her eyes, the silent plea. Do something. Save us. But what could he do? He sat down again, close to the fire, and reached out his hands. The coals glowed faintly. He thought of banking them, covering them with ash so they might live till morning. But the ash was damp, clotted with mud. Would it smother the embers completely, or preserve them? He did not know. He closed his eyes. He thought of the fields, now buried in snow. He thought of the harvest gone, the grain eaten long ago. He thought of neighbours already lost. Old Peter, found frozen in his bed. The miller's wife, who never woke one morning. The 3 children from the house beyond the stream, carried out together beneath sheets. Every winter claimed its tribute. This one had been crueler than most. Agnes's voice pulled him back. "Martin," she said softly. "The baby." He opened his eyes. The child had gone limp, his cries silenced. For a terrible moment, Martin thought he was gone. But then a shallow breath rose from his chest, faint and fragile. Agnes wept quietly. If he survives this night, he will be strong forever. He must. Martin reached over, placed his rough hand upon the baby's head. "He will," he said, though he had no right to promise. The grandmother stirred again. "Bank the fire," she said. "Do it now." Martin obeyed. He scooped ash over the glowing coals, burying them carefully, like a treasure hidden beneath the earth. He left a small gap for breath, praying he had judged correctly. Then he leaned back, exhausted, and pulled his children close around him. They slept in a tangled heap. Father, mother, children, grandmother, all pressed together, their breaths mingling, their hearts beating against one another. Their bodies formed a fortress of warmth, weak yet defiant. Above them, the storm raged on. The roof groaned. The wind keened. Snow crept into corners, gathering like silent assassins waiting for their chance. But within that circle of bodies, one ember lived beneath the ash, and as long as that ember glowed, however faintly, so did hope. Morning arrived not with light, but with a dim grey smear through the cracks of the hut, a light so thin it barely deserved the name. The storm had not ended. It pressed against the walls, whistling through every hole, rattling the thatch above. Snow piled high outside, heavy enough that the door groaned on its crude hinges when Martin tried to push it open. He gave up quickly. No one would be leaving until the wind relented. Inside, the family stirred. Agnes sat upright with the baby still clutched to her chest. His tiny breaths rose and fell in shallow rhythm, each one precious, each one a victory. The other children blinked awake, their hair stiff with frost, their faces pale but alive. The grandmother opened her eyes and muttered something too faint to catch. The fire pit was no more than a mound of grey ash. Martin bent over it with dread, scraping away with blackened fingers until, with relief, he found a faint orange glow hiding beneath. One ember, barely clinging but still alive. He exhaled carefully, coaxing it, feeding it dry straw in trembling handfuls. Smoke curled, flames crackled, and warmth returned, thin but steady. Agnes closed her eyes in silent thanks. "Another day," she whispered. "Another day," Martin echoed, though he wondered what that day would bring. Survival was not a gift freely given. It had to be wrestled from the cold. One trick, one scrap, one desperate act at a time. He had learned such tricks from his father, and his father from his father before him. The knowledge of how to survive a medieval winter was not written in books, but in scars, in lost fingers, in graves dug shallow in frozen earth. It was wisdom carried in whispers, passed along by those who had endured long enough to teach. The children gathered close as Martin stirred the fire. Their eyes watched him, solemn and wide, as if the ember itself were some kind of holy relic. He realized then that they too must learn these tricks, for no book would save them, no priest, no lord. Only knowledge and stubbornness would stand between them and the grave. He began with the most important lesson, the fire. "You never let it die," he told Thomas, pressing the boy's hand near the coals. "Not once, not for an hour. If the fire dies, so do we." Thomas nodded gravely. "I won't let it." "You will," Martin said more gently. "Everyone does once, and then you will learn what it costs. Pray it is not too high." He showed them how to bank the embers with ash at night, how to leave just enough space for air, how to poke gently in the morning until a spark awoke. It was a delicate balance, like nursing a child, demanding patience and humility. The grandmother added her own wisdom. "A good fire chases away not just cold, but pests," she croaked. "Fleas, lice, even spirits. The smoke keeps them back. Breathe it deep, and though your lungs burn, you'll live longer than those who don't." Margaret wrinkled her nose at the thought, but she listened all the same. The day dragged on. There was no work to be done outside. The fields lay buried, the tools frozen in the shed. Survival within the hut became their only labour. Every small act was a battle against the storm. When drafts cut through the walls, Agnes stuffed the gaps with moss gathered in autumn, or with rags too worn to serve as clothing. Martin plastered fresh mud mixed with straw over the worst cracks, his fingers red and numb. "Dung works better," he admitted with a grimace. "But I'd rather not smell it unless we must." The grandmother laughed, a dry, crackling sound. "Better dung than death, boy. Remember that when the frost bites." Meals were another battle. What little food remained had to be stretched like gold. A pot of thin broth bubbled over the fire, flavoured with turnips shriveled from storage and a few onions nearly sprouting. Into it Agnes crumbled hard rye bread, stale and bitter, but filling enough. "It's not much," she said, passing bowls to the children, "but it will warm you." Thomas spooned the broth greedily, ignoring the taste. Margaret, though, wrinkled her face. "I don't like it," she whispered. Agnes's eyes hardened. "Then you'll like the cold more?" "Eat, child. Every bite is warmth," Martin added. "Food keeps the fire in your belly. Without it, the fire in the hearth is useless." Margaret ate, sulking, but she ate. Hunger was the best teacher. Afterward, the family gathered their cloaks and tunics, layering them against the cold. Thomas wrapped his legs in rags before sliding his feet into wooden clogs. Agnes draped an old sheepskin across her shoulders, the smell of goat strong but comforting. They looked like beggars playing dress-up, yet every layer was a shield against death. "Don't wash them," Martin reminded the children when Margaret tugged at a filthy sleeve. The dirt and grease keep the wind out, Margaret blinked. But it smells. It smells of life, Martin said. Better to stink and live than be clean and frozen. The grandmother nodded sagely. Holy filth, she murmured. Never trust a man who looks too clean in winter. The children laughed, though the truth of it was bitter. That night, as darkness returned, they prepared again for sleep. This time Martin showed them another trick, how to sleep not apart, but together, pressed close like logs in a fire. You lie here, he told Thomas, placing the boy on one side, and you, Margaret, beside your mother. I will take the edge, with the cold, the strongest on the outside, the weakest in the centre. That way the heat stays in. They lay together on the straw mattress, lumpy and damp, but it held them off the frozen floor. The baby was nestled between Agnes and Margaret. Tiny warmth guarded on all sides. The grandmother curled close to Martin's back, her thin body surprisingly hot despite her age. They formed what he called a human wall. What others whispered was a human stew. Privacy was gone, comfort too, but survival demanded it. Within minutes, the hut was filled with the sound of overlapping breaths, snores, murmurs. But sleep did not come easily for Martin. He lay awake, staring into the shadows, listening to the wind batter the hut. His thoughts churned with fear and determination. He thought of neighbours who refused to huddle together, who clung to dignity and space. Many of them were now buried beneath snow. Dignity did not feed the fire. Pride did not keep the blood warm. The baby stirred, coughed softly. Agnes soothed him with a hand on his chest. Martin reached over, joining his hand to hers. Together they shielded the child between them, a wall against the night. Hours dragged. The fire hissed and spat, the embers glowing faint beneath the mound of ash. Martin rose more than once to poke at it, to add another handful of straw, another scrap of wood. His body ached, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but he refused to let it die. At one point, the grandmother woke and shuffled to the hearth. She squatted low, her face lit orange by the glow. When I was a girl, she whispered, we had nothing but turnip peels to eat. My brother died with his mouth full of snow, but I lived. Do you know why? Martin shook his head. She smiled faintly, a terrible, toothless grin. Because I learned, I watched, I remembered. Winter teaches, if you're willing to learn. She tossed a handful of dried rushes onto the coals, and they flared again. Then she returned to her place among the sleepers. Martin sat by the fire a long time after, staring into its heart. He thought of the tricks they used, banking the flames, stuffing moss, wearing filth, eating heavy meals, sleeping in piles. They were not noble or heroic. They were ugly, desperate, humiliating even. Yet they worked. They were the difference between life and the grave. The storm howled outside, relentless. But inside the hut, one ember lived. One ember, one family, one stubborn refusal to die. And in that, there was hope. The storm did not end with dawn. It lingered for days, then weeks, stretching into a season that seemed determined to break every family in the village. The snow piled higher than a man's shoulders, sealing the fields, silencing the roads. Smoke rose only from a handful of chimneys now, and even those plumes were thin, hesitant, as if the fires beneath them feared their own extinction. Inside Martin's hut, the air grew heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp straw and smoke. The family's cheeks hollowed. Their clothes hung looser with each passing day. The children no longer played or argued. They only sat, conserving what strength remained, their eyes glassy, their lips pale. Food was nearly gone. What remained were the seed grains, precious kernels meant for spring planting, carefully stored in a clay pot in the corner. Martin stared at it often, torn between two choices that each led to ruin. If they ate the seed, they would live another week, perhaps two. But come spring, the fields would yield nothing. The earth would be barren. Next year there would be no harvest, no hope. Agnes knew the choice too. She said little, but Martin caught her gaze lingering on the clay pot. Sometimes she bit her lip until it bled. Sometimes she wept quietly into the baby's hair, her tears soaking the filthy cloth that wrapped him. Thomas, old enough to understand, finally spoke one night as the fire dwindled. "Father," he whispered, "what if we planted nothing? What if we left this place? There must be food somewhere else." Martin shook his head. "The roads are buried. Even if we left, where would we go? To another village? They starve as we do. To the castle? The Lord's men would laugh and send us away. No, boy, we stay. We endure." The grandmother's voice, raspy and faint, added from her corner, "The seeds are our future. Guard them, even if it kills you. Better that than nothing at all. But the baby cried that night until his throat grew raw. Margaret curled against her mother, whimpering with hunger. Martin felt the walls closing in, the weight of his family's need pressing on his chest like a stone. The following morning, news came like a knife. Old Peter, the neighbour whose hut stood at the far end of the lane, had been found frozen in his bed. No one had seen smoke from his chimney in days, and when two men finally went to check, they found him stiff and white, hands folded as though in prayer. The village gathered in silence to bury him. There was no ground to dig. The soil was frozen hard as iron. Instead, they carved a shallow hollow in the snow and laid him there, covering his body with more snow until it became his tomb. A crude wooden cross was planted above, though everyone knew it would vanish when the next storm came. Agnes clutched Martin's arm tightly during the burial. "That could be us," she whispered. "It won't be," Martin said, but his voice cracked, betraying the doubt in his heart. In the nights that followed, the family huddled tighter, clung harder to life. Martin rationed the broth so thin it was little more than cloudy water. The children licked their bowls clean, desperate for even the taste of food. One evening, Margaret fell asleep before eating her portion. Agnes tried to wake her, shaking her gently, then harder. At last the girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "I'm so tired, Mother," she murmured. "I just want to sleep." Agnes pressed the bowl to her lips. "Drink," she urged. "Drink, or you'll never wake again." Margaret obeyed, swallowing slowly, then slumping back against her mother. The sight terrified Martin more than any storm. Hunger could steal not only flesh but will. When the will died, the body soon followed. The grandmother's cough grew worse. She shivered even when pressed close against the others, her skin clammy, her breath shallow. Yet she clung fiercely to life, muttering prayers, demanding stories, ordering the children to recite their lessons. "If I die," she croaked one night, "remember this. Winter is not the end. It only feels like it. The earth sleeps, but it wakes again. You must live to see it wake." But the storm was merciless. Days blurred into nights. The fire grew weaker, the food scarcer. At last, Martin could no longer resist the sight of the clay pot in the corner. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, the grains gleamed like tiny jewels, precious beyond gold. Agnes's voice broke the silence. "Don't," she whispered. "They will die," Martin said hoarsely. "Tonight, tomorrow. What good is seed in spring if there are no hands left to plant it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "If we eat it now, there will be no spring for us. You know that." The argument burned hotter than the fire. Thomas begged them both to stop. Margaret cried. The baby wailed, sensing the tension. In the end, Martin lowered the lid again, his whole body shaking. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly defeated. That night, the wind battered the hut harder than ever before. Snow forced its way through the thatch, dusting their faces as they slept. Martin dreamed of fields green with wheat, of children running barefoot beneath the sun. Then he woke to the bitter cold and the sound of the baby coughing. Morning came with silence. Too much silence. No birds, no dogs, not even the usual creak of neighbours moving about. When Martin pushed open the door, a wall of snow greeted him. He dug his way out, breath burning in his chest, and found the village hushed, as if the storm had stolen even the voices of the living. 2 huts had no smoke at all. By evening, word spread, another family gone. The Carters, with their 2 young boys. Their fire had died in the night, and the cold had claimed them before dawn. The village gathered once more for a burial in the snow. Mothers wept openly. Fathers stood grim and pale. Every death was a mirror, reflecting the future that might await them all. That night, as Martin's family huddled around the fire, he could not shake the image of the Carters lying still in their beds. He thought of their children, faces blue, lips frozen. He thought of Peter, stiff beneath the snow. He thought of the seeds in the pot, useless treasures while life slipped away. He held his children close, feeling their thin bodies against his own. He pressed his lips to the baby's head, whispering fiercely, "Not you, not tonight, not ever." The fire sputtered. The storm howled. Death knocked at the door, but the ember still glowed, faint yet defiant, in the heart of the hearth. And as long as it lived, so did they. The court of France was a world of silk and candlelight. a place where words carried the weight of weapons and gestures could change the fate of nations. It was there, amid the glitter and intrigue, that Anne Boleyn had come of age. She had been little more than a girl when her father sent her across the Channel. Yet by the time she returned to England, she carried herself like a woman born to the throne of Europe. Anne remembered the French courts as vividly as one recalls a dream, half fantasy, half sharp reality. She had walked through halls painted with gold, where ladies wore gowns that shimmered like jewels, and men debated politics with the same elegance as they recited poetry. She had learned not only how to dance, but how to look a man in the eye without lowering her gaze, how to answer with wit instead of silence, how to carry secrets within a smile. The French Queen's ladies had taken her in, teaching her refinement and grace. Anne had watched them carefully, absorbing every detail, the tilt of a head when entering a room, the calculated pause before a reply, the art of speaking volumes with a single gesture. It was an education no English tutor could ever provide. By the time she set foot again on English soil, Anne was transformed. The damp grey skies and the heavy manners of Henry VIII's court seemed almost provincial compared to the brilliance she had left behind. And yet in that contrast lay her power. She was not like the other women of England. She was sharper, bolder, more daring. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. The courtiers whispered as she passed, remarking on her dark eyes that gleamed with intelligence, on her long neck and graceful bearing. She was not the most beautiful woman at court, not in the traditional sense. Her features were sharp, her complexion darker than the pale ideal of English nobility. But beauty was only one currency, and Anne had learned in France that wit and confidence could purchase far more. She quickly became a favourite in noble circles. She spoke French fluently, sprinkling her words with clever turns of phrase that others struggled to imitate. She could sing, she could dance, she could hold a man's attention with nothing more than a tilt of her lips. And she carried with her an aura of mystery, a sense that she knew more than she ever revealed. Among those who noticed her was the king himself. Henry VIII was a man of appetites, food, drink, music, sport, and women. He was accustomed to admiration, to ladies bending easily beneath his charm. But when his eyes first fell on Anne, he saw not only beauty, but fire. It was during a masque, when the hall was filled with torches and laughter. Anne appeared dressed as Persephone, queen of the underworld, her gown a deep green that clung to her form, her hair loose beneath a crown of leaves. When she danced, she did not look at Henry. She looked past him, through him, as though he were merely another guest, unworthy of her notice. It was that indifference that struck him hardest. Henry was not a man to be ignored. He sent for her the next day, expecting compliance. Anne went, but she did not bow low enough, nor did she soften her gaze. She answered his questions directly, her tongue quick, her mind sharp. She laughed at his jokes, yes, but only the clever ones. When he attempted flattery, she parried with wit. Henry was captivated. This was no pliant mistress, no obedient court lady eager for a royal glance. This was a woman who dared to defy him, who seemed immune to his charms. He found himself both infuriated and enthralled. Anne, for her part, played her role with precision. She had no intention of becoming another of the king's conquests, discarded when his passion cooled. She had seen too many women at court ruined by such favours. If Henry wanted her, it would not be as a fleeting pleasure. It would be as something greater, something lasting. When he pressed her, offering jewels, land, even whispered promises of love, she refused. "I am no mistress, your majesty," she said, her voice steady. "I will not give you my virtue for baubles nor for words. If you would have me, it must be as your wife." Henry laughed at first. He already had a wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had given him a daughter and years of loyalty. Yet the seed was planted, and it grew in the soil of his dissatisfaction. Catherine had failed to give him a son, an heir to secure the Tudor line. The kingdom whispered of weakness, of God's displeasure. Perhaps, Henry thought, God meant for him to find another wife. Perhaps Anne was sent for this very purpose. At court, whispers turned to speculation. Who was this bold woman who dared deny the king? Who was this common daughter of Thomas Boleyn, who stood toe-to-toe with a monarch? Some admired her courage. Others spat her name like a curse, calling her arrogant, calculating, dangerous. Anne ignored them all. She wore their hatred like armour, feeding on it, letting it sharpen her resolve. She had returned from France with ambition burning in her heart. She would not settle for being a mistress, or even a favoured lady. She had seen queens, had watched them command respect and shape nations. She believed fiercely that she was destined for the same. Henry pursued her with increasing desperation. His letters grew more passionate, his gifts more extravagant. He wrote of his sleepless nights, of his hunger for her presence. Anne responded sparingly, always dangling the promise just out of reach. She gave him hope, then denied him, leaving him restless and obsessed. It was a dangerous game, one that placed her at the centre of the king's desire and the court's suspicion. Yet Anne thrived in it. She was no longer the girl who had left England years before. She was a woman who had learned the language of power, and now she spoke it fluently. Her return to England was not merely a homecoming. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. And though she could not yet see the gallows in her future, she felt the weight of destiny pressing against her shoulders. For the first time in her life, Anne Boleyn stood at the threshold of greatness, and the court of England would never be the same again. Henry VIII was not a man accustomed to waiting. He was a king, the embodiment of authority, and when he wanted something, he expected it delivered as swiftly as a hawk strikes its prey. But with Anne Boleyn, every moment of pursuit was a test of patience. The more she resisted, the more he burned. The court was alive with speculation. Ladies whispered behind gloved hands. Gentlemen traded knowing glances. Everyone saw the king's desire, how his eyes followed Anne across the hall, how he leaned closer whenever she spoke, how his laughter rang louder when she dared to mock him. It was scandal, entertainment, and danger wrapped in silk. Anne herself remained poised. She wore his attention like a cloak, but never allowed it to suffocate her. She knew too well what would happen if she surrendered too easily. She had seen women at court plucked from obscurity by Henry's passion, only to be cast aside once the flame cooled. Their names faded, their reputations ruined. She would not share that fate. When Henry presented her with a necklace studded with pearls and diamonds, she smiled sweetly and returned it untouched. "Your Majesty honours me," she said, "but I cannot accept what is not rightly mine." He frowned. "You are mine, Anne. I would give you the world if I could." "Then give me honour," she replied. "Give me the place of a wife, not the shame of a mistress." The words lodged in Henry's mind like a thorn. Catherine of Aragon, his queen of 20 years, remained loyal, steadfast, devout. Yet she had failed him in the one duty he prized most, producing a son. Their only surviving child, Mary, was bright but frail, and to Henry, a daughter could not secure the throne. England needed a prince, a warrior, a man to carry the Tudor name forward. Henry began to believe Catherine's failure was divine judgment. Perhaps their marriage had been cursed from the start. After all, Catherine had first been married to his brother Arthur. Henry convinced himself that God had withheld sons because the marriage was unholy, and now, perhaps God had shown him the answer in Anne. Anne, for her part, stoked this belief carefully. She spoke of destiny, of the future of England, of the greatness Henry could achieve with the right queen at his side. She never declared herself outright, but she allowed the king to imagine, to dream, to hunger. The court grew tense as Henry's obsession deepened. Catherine's supporters whispered of Anne as a witch, a temptress leading the king astray. The church stood firm. The marriage to Catherine was valid, sacred, indissoluble. The Pope himself had declared it so. But Henry's will was not easily denied. Letters began to flow between Henry and Anne. His were full of passion, declarations of torment, confessions of desire. He called her his mistress and friend, his heart's choice, his only comfort. He begged for her presence, lamented her refusals. Anne's replies were measured, almost cold. She offered him glimpses of affection, enough to keep him aflame, but never surrender. In one letter she wrote, "I beseech your Majesty not to take my refusal as disdain, but as proof of my virtue. I could never dishonour you, nor myself, by yielding to a love not sanctioned by God and law." The king was maddened by this restraint. Her refusal did not repel him, it consumed him. He could not eat, could not sleep without thoughts of her. He saw her face in the firelight, her laughter in the corridors. He felt as though he were the pursuer in a hunt, chasing prey that always managed to slip just beyond his reach. But Anne was no prey. She was the hunter too. At feasts, she danced with other men, smiling coyly, though never too much. She allowed Henry to watch, to feel the sting of jealousy. She spoke boldly at court, questioning policies, offering suggestions. Some lords sneered at her audacity, but Henry defended her, delighted by her sharpness. She was not like the docile Catherine. She was fire. The conflict within Henry grew sharper. By 1527, his desire for Anne had hardened into a decision. He would put Catherine aside. He would annul his marriage and take Anne as his wife, no matter the cost. The announcement shook the kingdom. Catherine, proud and pious, refused to yield. She declared herself Henry's true wife before God, and she would not be cast aside for another woman. Her supporters rallied, declaring Anne an intruder, a seductress, an enemy of the faith. The Pope refused Henry's request. The marriage was lawful, he said. No king could simply discard his wife for another. But Henry would not relent. He saw in Anne not just a woman, but the chance to secure the Tudor line with sons. He saw a future in which England was free from Rome's interference, in which he, the king, was master not only of state but of church. Anne pressed her advantage. She reminded him that true greatness often required sacrifice. A king, she said one night in the quiet of her chambers, is not measured by the ease of his reign, but by the trials he overcomes. England waits for its saviour, my lord. Will you be that man? Her words fed his ambition. Her refusal fed his desire. Between the two, Henry was ensnared. As the years dragged on, the struggle with Rome escalated. Henry demanded annulment. Rome delayed. Advisors warned caution, but Henry's patience had long since vanished. By 1532, he had resolved to break with the Pope entirely. He declared himself head of the Church of England, a move that would alter the course of history forever. And through it all, Anne remained at his side, still untouched, still waiting. She had won what no other woman in England had dared even dream. Not merely the king's favour, but the king's heart, his ambition, his rebellion. When at last, in a secret ceremony, Henry and Anne were wed, the court erupted in scandal. Catherine was cast aside, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. The Pope thundered with rage, declaring Henry's actions a sin against God. But Henry cared little. He had his Anne, he had his new queen, and Anne, triumphant at last, stood crowned in silks and jewels, her dark eyes blazing with victory. Yet, even in that moment of triumph, whispers stirred in the shadows. For every ally she had gained, she had earned 10 enemies. Every smile at court hid a dagger. Every cheer was tinged with resentment. Anne had won the king, and with him, the throne of England. But the game she had chosen was not finished. It had only just begun. The coronation of Anne Boleyn was unlike any other England had seen. On that June day in 1533, the streets of London were lined with banners and flowers, the air thick with the sound of trumpets and bells. Yet beneath the outward splendour lurked resentment. Many of the people did not cheer for their new queen. They whispered instead of Catherine wronged, of Rome defied, of a king bewitched by a woman too bold for her station. Anne sat high in her litter, carried through the city with jewels blazing at her throat and a crown heavy upon her dark hair. She smiled, but her heart beat fiercely. Every eye upon her felt like both adoration and accusation. She had won what she had sought, the crown of England, but as the procession wound its way to Westminster, she could sense the hostility, the hatred simmering behind the thin smiles of her subjects. Inside the abbey, the ceremony was magnificent. Archbishop Cranmer, Henry's loyal servant, placed the crown upon her head. Henry watched from his throne, his face proud, triumphant. Anne felt the weight of history pressed down upon her shoulders, along with the crown. She had risen higher than she had ever dared imagine, but even in that moment of triumph, she knew she stood upon a knife's edge. Soon after, she gave birth to her first child. On a September morning, the bells rang out, and courtiers gathered anxiously to hear the news. Henry had waited years for this moment, convinced that Anne would deliver him the son Catherine had denied. But when the midwives emerged, their arms carried not a prince, but a princess, Elizabeth. Anne wept when she saw her daughter, not for disappointment, but for the fierce, protective love that surged through her. The infant's tiny fingers curled around hers, and in that grip, Anne felt destiny itself. Elizabeth was her triumph, her future. But Henry's face, though he smiled for the court, was shadowed with disappointment. A girl was not enough. Anne knew she would have other chances. She threw herself into her duties as queen, appearing beside Henry in processions, speaking with authority and counsel, rewarding her allies, punishing her enemies. She was no silent consort. She wielded influence openly, and that alone earned her hatred. Noble families who had supported Catherine despised her. Even commoners muttered against her in taverns, calling her the concubine and the witch. At court, her enemies multiplied. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, began to see her as an obstacle. The Seymours, a family ambitious and cunning, rose quietly as Henry's attention shifted toward Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The pressure upon Anne grew unbearable. She miscarried her second child, then another. Each loss was a wound not only to her body, but to her standing. Henry's patience wore thin. He still visited her chambers, still touched her with affection, but his eyes wandered and his temper flared. Anne fought back with the only weapons she had, her voice and her will. She quarreled with Henry, sometimes openly, accusing him of betrayal, demanding his loyalty. But every word that passed her lips gave her enemies more ammunition. "The Queen rages," they whispered. "The Queen scolds the king like a fishwife." Henry did not like to be reminded of his failings. His pride demanded submission, and Anne gave none. Still, she had her moments of strength. Elizabeth grew, a lively and intelligent child. Anne surrounded her with the best tutors, declaring that her daughter would be educated like a prince. "She will outshine them all," Anne told her ladies. "She will prove that a woman may rule as well as any man." Her vision was clear, but the present was treacherous. The court was a nest of vipers, and Anne stood at its center. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word twisted. Rumors spread of her temper, of her arrogance, of her cruelty. Some even whispered that she dabbled in sorcery, that she had ensnared the king with spells. Her miscarriages deepened the shadows. In January 1536, she lost another child, a boy. The blow was devastating. Henry's disappointment hardened into coldness. He began to speak less of love, more of duty. Jane Seymour's presence grew more obvious. She was quiet, submissive, everything Anne was not. Anne saw the danger clearly. She confronted Jane once, tearing a locket from her neck that bore the king's portrait. "Do not meddle where you have no right," she hissed. But Jane's silence was more powerful than any retort. The tide was turning. Cromwell, sensing Henry's waning affection, began to plan. Anne had too many enemies, too much pride, too little protection. The king wanted freedom. Cromwell would provide it. But Anne did not know, not yet. She still believed she could regain Henry's love, that another pregnancy would save her. She clung to Elizabeth, to her faith, to her determination. She prayed daily, kneeling for hours until her knees ached. She told herself that God would not abandon her, that he had chosen her for this destiny. Yet even in prayer, doubt gnawed at her. She had climbed higher than any woman of her birth could dream. But every crown, she realized, was forged of iron and blood. And as the winter deepened, Anne felt the shadows gathering around her, the cold breath of enemies waiting just beyond the torchlight. She was still queen, still powerful, still unbroken. But the cracks in her throne had begun to spread, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. The crown upon her head weighed heavier than ever, not with jewels, but with dread. The Tower of London loomed against the grey May sky, its ancient stones damp with mist. Ravens circled above as though they knew what was to come. Within its walls, Anne Boleyn waited, her fate sealed not by justice, but by the will of a king who no longer loved her. Her imprisonment had begun suddenly. On the morning of May 2nd, 1536, she had been summoned to Henry's presence, only to be confronted by a delegation of guards. They accused her of adultery, of incest, of treason. The charges were monstrous, absurd, but Anne knew at once what they meant. It was not evidence that mattered, but convenience. The king wanted her gone, and this was the weapon chosen to destroy her. She had gone to the tower by barge, her head held high despite the horror swirling around her. Crowds gathered on the banks of the Thames, murmuring as she passed. Some pitied her, some jeered, some merely watched in silence. She had been their queen, and now she was their spectacle. Inside the tower, she was lodged in the very same royal apartments once prepared for her coronation. The irony was cruel. She remembered the joy, the triumph, the sense of destiny she had felt 3 years earlier. Now those same walls closed around her like a coffin. Her ladies whispered prayers, but Anne herself remained calm. "Do not weep for me," she told them. "If I am guilty, I deserve death. If I am innocent, I shall face it with God's grace." But when she was alone, she trembled. She thought of Elizabeth, her daughter, barely 3 years old. Would the child even remember her mother's face? Would Henry cast Elizabeth aside as he had cast Anne? The thought was more painful than death itself. The trial began on May 15th. Anne was led from her chambers to the great hall within the tower, where peers of the realm gathered to sit in judgment. They were men she had once dined with, laughed with, even supported in their ambitions. Now they sat solemn and cold, their eyes averted, their loyalty shifted to the king. The charges were read aloud. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, conspiracy against the king's life, witchcraft, treason. The words echoed like poison in the vaulted chamber. Anne lifted her head, her voice clear. "My lords, I do not confess to these falsehoods. I have been a faithful wife to the king. I have borne him a child. I have sought his glory, his peace, his comfort. I may have spoken unwisely, but never have I betrayed my husband, nor my God." Her words stirred murmurs among the crowd, but the outcome had been decided long before. Witnesses were produced, men who spoke of secret meetings, of whispered promises, of imagined embraces. Some had been tortured, others bribed. Their testimonies were riddled with contradictions, but none of it mattered. When her brother George was brought in, accused of incest with his own sister, Anne's composure nearly shattered. She wept openly as he denied the charges, his voice ringing with pride and anger. But like her, he was doomed. The trial stretched on, a parade of lies and twisted truths. At last, the peers withdrew to deliberate. They were gone only a short while before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Anne stood as the sentence was pronounced. Death, to be carried out at the king's pleasure. The method was mercy by comparison, beheading by sword rather than the axe. It was said Henry had granted her this favour, a final gift to the woman he once loved. When the hall emptied, Anne collapsed into her chair, her strength gone. Yet she did not scream, nor curse, nor beg. She whispered instead, "O Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." In the days that followed, she prepared herself for death. She confessed her sins to her chaplain, though she continued to insist upon her innocence. She wrote a final letter to Henry, though it is said he never read it. In it, she begged him to care for Elizabeth, to protect the child they had brought into the world. Her ladies kept vigil with her, sewing her final gown, praying at her side. Anne herself seemed almost serene. "I have lived 3 years as queen," she said softly. "I shall die with more honor than many have lived. Do not fear for me. My soul is safe." On the morning of May 19th, she rose early, dressed in a gown of grey damask trimmed with fur, and placed a mantle of ermine upon her shoulders. A white coif covered her hair, with a small cap of black velvet atop it. She looked not like a criminal, but a queen prepared for her final duty. She walked to the scaffold with steady steps, her ladies following in tears. The crowd gathered silently, thousands pressing close to witness the fall of a queen. The French executioner, summoned specially for the task, stood ready with his great sword. Anne mounted the scaffold and turned to address the crowd. Her voice carried clearly, calm and resolute. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to the law, for by the law I am judged to die. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. If any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." She did not protest her innocence. She knew it would change nothing. Instead, she offered her life to God, her forgiveness to her enemies, her loyalty even to the man who had condemned her. Then she knelt upon the straw, her hands clasped in prayer. Her ladies wept as they removed her mantle and bound her eyes. She whispered softly, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my soul." The executioner lifted his sword. With one swift stroke, it was done. The crowd gasped, then fell into hushed silence. Her body was placed in a simple arrow chest, buried in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds. There were no processions, no bells, no honours. Only the memory of a queen who had risen from obscurity to sit upon England's throne, and who had paid for her ambition with her life. Yet Anne's story did not end there, for in a cradle at Hatfield lay her daughter Elizabeth, small and fragile, but destined to outshine them all. Anne had died branded a traitor, but her blood would live to shape the future of England. And as the ravens wheeled above the tower, the first whispers of her legend began. The year was 1770, and Boston simmered like a pot left too long over the fire. On its narrow streets, lined with crooked houses and crowded taverns, tension brewed with every passing day. The colonies had grown restless under the rule of a king an ocean away, and in Boston, the restlessness had hardened into defiance. For years, Parliament had reached across the sea with laws and taxes that pressed upon the people's backs like stones. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, now the hated Tea Act. Each measure demanded money without offering a voice in return. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It was a cry for dignity, a demand that men not be treated as mere subjects, but as citizens. Boston was the beating heart of resistance. Its docks bustled with merchants forced to pay duties they despised. Its taverns buzzed with whispers of rebellion, and its meeting houses thundered with speeches that shook rafters and souls alike. The Sons of Liberty, a loose brotherhood of artisans, merchants and labourers, moved through the city like sparks in dry timber. They posted handbills, organised protests, and spoke openly of freedom in ways that once would have been unthinkable. The presence of British troops only fanned the flames. Redcoats patrolled the streets in their bright uniforms, muskets gleaming in the sun, symbols of a king's authority that few in Boston respected anymore. Their boots echoed against cobblestones, a reminder with every step that Boston was no longer master of its own fate. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, the tension snapped. Snow lay in dirty heaps along the roadside as a group of young men taunted a British sentry outside the custom house. Their words turned to insults, then to snowballs packed with ice. The sentry shouted for aid, and soon more soldiers appeared, muskets in hand. A crowd gathered quickly. Dockworkers, apprentices, women clutching their shawls tighter. Shouts rose, bells rang. Some said fire. Then a shot cracked the night, then another. Smoke filled the square. When it cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. The soldiers' muskets still smoked in their hands. The Boston Massacre, they called it afterward. Blood on the cobblestones, blood on the conscience of a people already close to rebellion. In the weeks that followed, funerals turned into processions, sermons into speeches. The names of the dead were written on banners, their blood compared to that of martyrs. The massacre became more than tragedy. It became rallying cry. Samuel Adams, a wiry man with sharp eyes and sharper words, stood in Faneuil Hall and declared, "This is tyranny. This is murder. This is proof that a king who rules with bayonets rules not over free men, but over slaves." His words carried beyond the walls, echoing through taverns and markets, across farms and villages, until the very air seemed charged with anger. Paul Revere, silversmith and patriot, engraved an image of the massacre, British soldiers firing in formation upon unarmed townsmen. It was reproduced, passed hand to hand, nailed to doors, tucked into Bibles. Truth and propaganda blurred, but the effect was the same. Rage spread like fire in dry grass. Yet beneath the fury lay fear. The British army was vast, disciplined, seemingly unstoppable. The colonies were divided, scattered, ill-prepared for war. Many still clung to loyalty, hoping Parliament might yet relent, hoping peace might be preserved. But in Boston, such hopes thinned with every day the redcoats marched through the streets. Merchants fumed at taxes that ate into their trade. Dockworkers cursed the customs officers who prowled the harbour. Farmers from nearby villages brought grain and beef to market, muttering that their sweat enriched only distant lords. Even ministers thundered from pulpits that tyranny was sin, that God himself had placed freedom in men's hands. Boston became a powder keg. Every tavern was a meeting hall. Every whispered word seemed a spark. In Green Dragon Tavern, the Sons of Liberty gathered, tankards of ale in hand, voices low but burning. They spoke of rights, of resistance, of what might come if Britain did not yield. Samuel Adams presided, his rhetoric sharp enough to cut steel. Beside him, John Hancock, wealthy merchant turned rebel, lent not only his voice but his purse to the cause. Still, caution warred with passion. "We are not ready for war," one man warned. "England would crush us like an ant beneath her boot." "We are already crushed," another replied. "Better to die standing than to live kneeling." Outside the tavern, children played mock battles in the snow, one side calling themselves British, the other patriots. Their laughter masked the truth that real battles, with real blood, might not be far away. In the harbour, British ships rocked on their anchors, cannons pointing toward the town. Their crews patrolled the docks, their eyes watchful, their tempers short. The very water seemed held hostage. By 1772, committees of correspondence linked Boston to other towns and colonies. Letters carried stories of the massacre, of Parliament's cruelty, of the rights denied to every free man. Each letter was a spark leaping from hearth to hearth, until a network of fire stretched from Massachusetts to Virginia. In Boston, the people waited. They knew another blow was coming, another law, another insult. They knew the powder keg would not remain unlit forever, and in December of 1773, that blow would come in the form of tea. But before that night of saltwater and defiance, Boston lived in the long shadow of the massacre. Every creak of a musket, every clatter of a soldier's boots, every toll of a church bell was a reminder. Freedom and tyranny stood on the same narrow street, face to face. The storm had not yet broken, but the sky was dark, the air charged, and all it needed was a spark. By the autumn of 1773, Boston was no longer a city merely simmering with resentment. It was a city on the verge of eruption. The Tea Act, passed by Parliament earlier that year, had struck at the heart of both Boston's economy and its pride. On its face, the law seemed simple. The East India Company, floundering under debt, would be allowed to sell its tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices. But the colonists saw the truth hidden beneath the offer. Cheap tea was bait. To buy it meant acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them. To drink it was to swallow chains. The ships came late in the year, sails straining against Atlantic winds, hulls heavy with tea. Their names, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, would be etched into memory forever. They anchored in Boston Harbour under the watch of British warships, their holds crammed with 342 chests of tea. The law demanded the cargo be unloaded within 20 days and duties paid. If not, the tea would be seized by customs and payment forced at the point of a musket. Boston's merchants and patriots bristled. They gathered in taverns and meeting houses, voices raised in anger, fists pounding wooden tables. "If we allow this tea to land," Samuel Adams thundered, "we admit we are slaves. If we resist, we declare ourselves free men." The people answered with cheers, their cries echoing down the narrow streets. On November 29th, the Old South Meeting House overflowed with bodies. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in hand, faces grim with determination. Samuel Adams presided, his words sharp and unwavering. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country," he declared at last. With that, the decision was sealed. The tea would not be unloaded. The days that followed were filled with tension so thick it seemed to cling to the air. The ships lay waiting in the harbour, their crews restless, their captains desperate. Governor Hutchinson, a loyalist by both blood and conviction, refused to relent. "The king's authority must not be mocked," he insisted, dispatching orders to ensure the tea would be landed, the duties collected. The city stood divided. Loyalists argued that resistance would bring ruin, that defying Parliament was madness. Patriots countered that submission would bring only chains. In taverns, debates turned to shouting, sometimes to blows. Neighbours eyed one another with suspicion. Even families split apart at dinner tables, half the room declaring loyalty to the crown, the other half swearing allegiance to liberty. On December 16th, the deadline loomed. Thousands gathered once more at Old South, the largest meeting Boston had ever seen. The air inside was thick with heat and breath, the pews and aisles packed, men climbing onto windowsills to hear. Outside, the streets were clogged with those who could not fit within, waiting for word. All day they argued. Messengers rushed in and out, bringing reports from the harbour, from the governor's house, from the soldiers stationed nearby. Each hour passed like the tick of a clock counting down to disaster. At last, near dusk, word arrived. The governor had refused once more. The tea would land. A silence fell over the meeting. All eyes turned to Samuel Adams. Slowly, he rose. His voice, though quiet, carried through the hall. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It was the signal. From the crowd emerged men disguised in rough clothes, their faces painted with soot and streaks of red. Some wore feathers in their hair, their forms cloaked in blankets. They moved quickly, purposefully, through the streets toward Griffin's Wharf. The disguise was crude, but the message was clear. They were no longer subjects of the crown. They were sons of a new land, striking for their freedom. Crowds followed, torches flickering in the winter night. The three ships loomed against the dark sky, their masts black against the stars. Crews stood aside as the disguised men boarded, armed with hatchets and mallets. Then the work began. Chest after chest was hauled up from the holds, pried open and heaved overboard. The tea spilled into the harbour, the water turning black with leaves, the air heavy with its sharp scent. The men worked with astonishing order, no drunken revelry, no theft. They destroyed the tea but touched nothing else. Discipline was their weapon, as much as the hatchets in their hands. On shore, the crowd watched in silence. No one cheered, no one jeered. The sound was only of wood splintering, of tea spilling, of water swallowing. Some wept openly, knowing what this act meant. There was no going back. By midnight, it was done. 342 chests lay scattered beneath the harbour's waves, their contents drifting out to sea. The men swept the decks clean, leaving not a single trace of tea. Then they disappeared into the night, their disguises discarded, their names hidden. The harbour stank of tea for days afterward. Fish floated belly up, stained with bitterness. Seagulls wheeled above the dark water, their cries echoing across the docks. British officials raged, merchants despaired, and loyalists shook their heads in fear. But for the patriots of Boston, the harbour had become a symbol, a declaration, written not in ink, but in defiance. News travelled swiftly. Riders carried the story to towns and villages, from Massachusetts to Virginia. Everywhere, the tale was told and retold, embellished, celebrated. "Boston has struck a blow!" men shouted in taverns. "Boston has shown the way." Yet even as the patriots rejoiced, others trembled. Parliament would not forgive this insult. The crown would not remain silent. Retribution would come, swift and merciless. And when it did, the colonies would face a choice: submit or rise together. But on that cold December night, as the last chest of tea sank beneath the waves, Boston had chosen its path. A storm had broken, and in its wake, a revolution stirred. The morning after the harbour turned black with tea, Boston woke to a silence heavy as lead. The ships lay at anchor, lighter now by hundreds of chests. The air still reeked of steeped leaves, bitter and pungent. Men walking the docks stopped to stare at the slick that spread across the water. Some smiled, proud. Others crossed themselves, fearful. What had been done could not be undone. Governor Hutchinson raged in his mansion. He wrote furious letters to London, demanding swift punishment. "This is open rebellion," he declared. "Boston has spat in the face of His Majesty's authority. If they are not brought to heel, the empire itself will unravel." His words would carry across the sea, into the halls of Parliament, where they were met with outrage and contempt. In taverns and meeting houses, the Sons of Liberty gathered, not in celebration, but in sober awareness. Samuel Adams, his eyes burning with conviction, addressed them. "We have made our stand. The die is cast. Britain will not forgive, nor forget. We must be ready for the storm to come." The storm came quickly. In London, Parliament thundered in anger. They passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonies soon called the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed, strangling trade, leaving merchants ruined, workers idle, families hungry. British troops were quartered in private homes, their red uniforms a daily reminder of subjugation. Town meetings were forbidden without royal approval, stripping the people of their voice. Boston became a city under siege, not by foreign armies, but by its own rulers. Soldiers marched the streets, muskets on their shoulders, cannons pointed toward the wharves. Ships patrolled the harbour, their sails blotting out the horizon. The message was clear: defiance would be crushed. But instead of breaking the spirit of the colonies, the punishment bound them together. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, from the Carolinas to New Hampshire, Word spread of Boston's plight. Wagons rolled north laden with grain, cattle, and supplies. Farmers donated harvests. Merchants sent money. Women sewed clothes for the suffering. Boston suffers for all of us, they said. We stand with Boston. The sense of unity was new, fragile but powerful. For the first time, 13 scattered colonies began to see themselves not as separate provinces, but as one people with a shared cause. In September 1774, delegates from across the colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress convened beneath high ceilings and open windows, the air thick with heat and urgency. Men like George Washington, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee spoke in turn, some cautious, some fiery. Patrick Henry rose, his voice ringing like a bell. The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. His words struck the hall like thunder. They drafted petitions to the king, still hoping for reconciliation, but they also organized boycotts, trained militias, prepared for war. The memory of tea dumped into Boston Harbor was never far from their minds. It had been the spark, the moment when protest became resistance, when loyalty bent and snapped. Back in Boston, redcoats drilled on the commons, their drums echoing across the frozen ground. Yet in barns and fields beyond the city, farmers drilled too, muskets in hand, learning to march, to fire, to stand. They were called Minutemen, ready to rise at a moment's notice. Their clothes were plain, their rifles old, but their spirit was fierce. Anne Boleyn had once faced a scaffold for daring to challenge a king's will. Centuries earlier, peasants had huddled in their huts against the cold, clinging to life with nothing but scraps of wisdom and stubborn will. And now, in Boston, men and women faced their own trial, a test of endurance and courage. History seemed to whisper that survival was never given freely. It had to be fought for, tooth and nail. As winter turned to spring, British generals plotted to seize colonial gunpowder and arrest rebel leaders. The patriots prepared to resist. Riders kept watch on the roads, ready to spread alarm. In taverns, voices dropped to whispers as plans were made, oaths sworn. The shadow of war lengthened across the land. On the night of April 18th, 1775, lanterns would gleam in the tower of Old North Church. Riders would gallop through the dark, crying that the redcoats were coming. Muskets would crack at Lexington and Concord, echoing across fields and rivers, the sound of a people choosing liberty over submission. But even before the first shot was fired, the revolution had already begun. It had begun in cold huts where peasants defied death by sharing warmth. It had begun in the ambitions of Anne Boleyn, who dared to stand against tradition and claim a crown. And it had begun in Boston Harbor, where men disguised as savages had cast a king's tea into the sea. The thread that bound them was courage, the refusal to bow, the will to endure, the belief that destiny belonged not to tyrants, but to those bold enough to seize it. As Boston settled uneasily beneath its occupation, no one could say what the months ahead would bring. But in the hearts of its people burned a fire brighter than the lanterns hung in the church tower, brighter even than the torches of soldiers. It was the fire of freedom, and it would not be extinguished.